So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the outlining process, and more specifically a 15-point outline process that I used for many years. I don't use it quite as much anymore, but it is incredibly helpful, so I thought I would share it with any new screenwriters who kind of wanted a little bit of a guide. I'm sure you're aware of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the Dan Harmon story circle. It's basically the same concept, but it's just broken down a lot more meticulously. So I wanted to run through it one by one and see what you guys think. It's crazy to think that you could take a 15-point outline and basically graph any movie onto it and see exactly where it hits all these individual beats, or at least a good portion of these individual beats. So let's just get right into it, starting with step 1 on the outline. We call it open intro. So in a horror movie, your intro is usually the first kill. In Scream, it's the introduction to Casey and the first murder by Ghostface. In Jaws, it's the first shark attack. This is basically your opportunity to tell your audience the tone of the movie that they're about to watch. The opening doesn't necessarily need to set up the plot of the movie, but it should always set up your tone. And that brings us to number 2, Ordinary World. So, Ordinary World, it's where we all live, hopefully. Any of you who are not currently in your Ordinary World phase, I hope things get better. Ordinary World is exactly what it sounds like. It's just the ordinary world in which we are living before we go on our Joseph Campbell hero's journey.
Coming to bed, honey?
Yes, dear.
In a romantic comedy, it's the couple that just got married, their happy life before something horrible happens. Is that a romantic comedy? That doesn't sound right. It's Rocky just trying to get by in his life, not taking any big swings. It's Tony Stark being an egotistical idiot. It's our hero not being the best that they can be, generally. And that brings us to number 3. Inciting incident. Inciting incident is where the story begins. Your inciting incident is your opportunity to go on this journey. And most times, the hero will initially refuse the call to action, and that is step 4. The refusal or debate. Debate or refusal stage. So this is your hero refusing to go on the hero's journey, choosing to stick with their ordinary life, and that brings us to the new world. So, this is when exciting things begin to happen to your hero. If the refusal is Dr. Grant and Sadler not wanting to go to Jurassic Park, New World is Jurassic Park. Now we have arrived. We are on the island. Let's see what happens next. Number 6. Fun, allies, and enemies. Now this is probably the most important part of any movie, in my opinion. It's not necessarily the plot, it's not necessarily the story, but it is the reason we watch movies, for fun, good guys and bad guys. That's what we want to see when we go to the movie. So this is when the villain is introduced. This is when our side characters are introduced. In Lord of the Rings, it's meeting Pippin and Merry and going on the quest, and suddenly there's some danger. We're having a little bit of fun, and now we're scared. Fun, allies, enemies. This section usually lasts between 10 and 20 minutes in the movie, depending on the length of the film, and depending on the writer's interpretation of what this actually means. But that is getting to the midpoint, and then the midpoint is a small success. It's in a superhero movie, it's Spider-Man figuring out how to shoot the webs, it's learning to fly, it's learning to fight, it's learning kung fu.
I know kung fu.
Show me.
But as soon as your hero has had a small success, in order to keep things interesting, there needs to be stakes raised. So now we're raising the stakes. So at this point, the villain becomes stronger, or the challenge becomes more difficult, or the hero becomes injured. You know, something has happened now so that the small success doesn't matter as much anymore. This hill that I just walked over is nothing compared to the mountain I must now climb. So the stakes are raised. After the stakes are raised, let's go up here, you have what is called false information. False information, in a mystery film, it's thinking that you know who the killer is. In a rom-com, it's misinterpreting something, thinking that your spouse is having an affair, thinking that your friend has betrayed you. And what happens inevitably once we receive false information, things start to look bleak. So we have things look bleak. Things look bleak is not necessarily our low point, but it is the path to the low point, and that is number 11. The low point is the part of the movie where the best friend dies, or the couple breaks up. In every Seth Rogen movie ever,
the guys are friends, and then they're not friends, and then at the end of the movie, they're friends again.
In every romantic comedy, it's the breakup. It's the part of the movie where the character changes their outgoing voicemail to let you know that they're now depressed.
This is John. Whatever.
Number 12. New realization. So, it couldn't go on for long. The character finally has to learn the truth. Shrek has to find out that Fiona wasn't talking about him when she said someone was ugly. She was talking about herself. New realization. Now we get to go on our race to the climax. In every romantic comedy, this is racing to the airport to catch the girl. This is stopping the wedding. In a police thriller, it's trying to get to the victim before the killer does. In Lord of the Rings, it's that last stretch to Mordor. And once we have raced, there's nowhere to go but the climax. We're at the climax. This is the final fight. This is the final confrontation. This is the final showdown. We finally arrived at the ultimate point of the movie. We are now going to find out if our hero wins or loses. Rocky doesn't win, but he achieves his goal. In the movie, he just wanted to go the distance. He mentions that a couple of times. If in Rocky he had not said in that one speech to Adrian, all he wants to do is go the distance, the ending would not have worked because it's not actually achieving the character's goal. Him losing doesn't matter, but if he hadn't gone the distance, it wouldn't have been a strong ending. We have our climax. And after the climax, you have what I call the final scare. Again, horror is the perfect example for this. It's the last scare. It's finding out that the killer is still alive. It's when Dr. Loomis looks out the window and Michael is gone. It's Jason jumping out of the water at the end of Friday the 13th. It's the arm coming out of the ground at the end of Carrie. It's Ghostface jumping out one last time at the end of Scream.
Careful. This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
That is our final scare. And it applies to all movies. You know, in Marvel, they do their end credit sequences. It's just one last note that they want to leave you with. If the movie has a very intense ending, sometimes the filmmaker doesn't want you to leave with that taste in your mouth. So they usually tag it with a joke at the end.
Not in my movie.
But basically, that is the breakdown. And if you look at this carefully, you will be able to start to see all your favorite movies in this. And, you know, name any movie, and we can walk through each of these points. It may not necessarily be in that exact order every time. And some of these may look a little bit different. But for the most part, this is how movies are done. And for me personally, once I started using this as my outlining process, the entire way that I wrote scripts changed. Initially, the fun for me was coming up with the story while I was writing it. The enjoyment I got was finding out, along with the characters, what was going to happen next. So as soon as I moved that fun into the outlining process, it made writing a script a little bit less exciting, but I did get to keep that excitement in the outlining process. So now for me, at least at a certain point when I was doing this regularly, which was a good dozen scripts of mine, I would write a 10-page, generally somewhere in that range, 10-page outline, just breaking down my plot into these 15 sections, and I would often have, ideas kind of tagged along with asterisks at the bottom, and those would be kind of plot points that I wasn't sure exactly where they would go, so you don't need to drive yourself crazy. If you have ideas and you want to use this outline process, but you don't know exactly where those ideas are going to go, don't worry about that. Just put that in your notes and just remind yourself that you're going to need to find a place to put that, and while you're writing, it may suddenly dawn on you, or more likely what happens is you get to a point and you suddenly realize something needs to happen that you didn't account for in the outline, and that's where you can shove it in. Yeah, so for me, my first 10 or so scripts, I did not outline at all. I would just jump right into it. It was the most fun I had writing scripts because I wasn't thinking about sellability, I wasn't thinking about marketability, I wasn't thinking about production or cost. I was just trying to have as much fun as possible. I made another video called My First 5 Scripts where I talked about the process of writing those 5 scripts. If you want to check that out, you can hear a little bit more about how absolutely fantastic those are. But once I started this outlining process, I went 100% into it, and that was the only way that I did it for several years. But what happened is, at a certain point, I started to realize that you really start to put yourself in a box if you're determining how your movie's going to end before you actually write it. And listen, that's not always the case. If you're writing a mystery, you need to know how it's going to end to some degree. You know, there's always going to be some genres where you need to know where you're going before you get there. But overall, I think that in order to make sure that your film is not completely mathematical, it's actually better to outline the first 2 acts and then have a very loose idea of what's going to happen in the 3rd act, and then just let the script kind of guide you so that you can find out yourself. Because I've said this before, but the amount of times that I came up with some ideas in the outline for what was going to happen to a side character, for example, and then suddenly they get into a confrontation. And in my outline, I decided everyone leaves that confrontation alive, but while I'm writing the script, I just decide that one of these characters is going to mouth off or is going to pull some dumb move, and suddenly he gets himself killed. And that's just what happens naturally in writing that scene, even if I hadn't necessarily planned for it. So when that happens, suddenly everything I had outlined with that character goes out the window. So I always have to be prepared for things like that, and you kind of want to give yourself room for things like that to happen because it makes the story feel less color by number. It makes it start to feel a lot more alive. After several years of outlining this way, I started to kind of slowly go back to the old way. I would go from having 10, 15, 20-page outline to having 5-page outlines, and then 3-page outlines, and then it would just be like a 1-pager where I just do basically a sentence for each of these just to have the generic idea of where I'm going with the story, but then I jump into it and kind of go fly by the seat of your pants like I did when I was 17.
If you only ever take one piece of advice about redrafting your screenplay, let it be this. In life, not every problem can be fixed, but sometimes, in screenwriting, your problems can fix each other. Okay, so let me give you an example. About a year ago, I wrote a TV pilot, about a 60-page long murder mystery. In my first draft, I created a bunch of these different threads, thinking at some point I'll figure out some creative way to have it all tie together. So, in the first 3 pages of my script, I have a character, her name is Esme Leroux. She's a French policewoman who is traveling to America to investigate the murder of her younger sister. And in the first scene, I show her packing her purse. And so I'm able to have a few different items that she places into the purse be character pieces in different ways. Objects that will immediately tell the audience a little bit about this person. So some of those things I ended up finding ways to tie back into the script. You know, for example, in this kind of story, it's sort of like a Chekhov's gun, where, you know, Chekhov's gun is the idea that in a movie, if you show a gun, it needs to be fired before the end of the movie. Otherwise, why are you showing the gun? Typically, it'll be done where a character is rifling through someone's belongings, and they'll open up a drawer, and there's a gun in that drawer. Now imagine you're watching a movie or a TV show, and something like that is introduced. And a character opens the drawer, and there's a gun inside. And then they quietly close the drawer. and then it's never shown again, never mentioned again. No matter how good the rest of that movie or TV series is, you're always going to go, wait, why'd they do that? Why'd they show the gun? What was the purpose? Why did the camera need to get a close-up of this item if that item is never used again, let alone used in an important way to the plot? So, a few of the items that I had this character put into her purse tell the story of who she is and help inform the plot and story moving forward. However, there was one thing in her bag that was just kind of random. I had her put in a chocolate bar.
Chocolate? Did you say chocolate?
And I don't know why. I don't know anything about Europe. I don't know French people. But something about that just seemed right. This French woman who's kind of a hard-edged character, suddenly having a sweet tooth meant that she was more relatable, more likable. And that was the only reason that I had her put a chocolate bar into her purse. So the script takes place primarily at a hotel. And so I'm creating these threads of characters in the hotel who could potentially be suspects in the murder, or could potentially be victims or witnesses, etc. In this hotel, I had characters who are only there for the weekend. I have characters who are kind of hanging around, even though they don't necessarily have a room at the hotel, which makes them very suspicious. And then I thought it would be interesting to also have a few characters who live at the hotel long term. So I had one of these characters be a guy who seems like the obvious main suspect. He's just kind of creeping around the whole time. And I think ultimately I ended up revealing that he's like a PI or someone who's also there on behalf of a missing girl. So it kind of throws you off thinking that this guy is the villain, when in fact he's also on the same journey as Esme. And then I had another character who's a woman who I thought, just to add a little more conflict, it's a woman who is very reclusive. She lives at the hotel just because it happens to be cheaper than other options for her. And she has this little annoying yappy dog. And I thought, that's another nice piece. You know, we're in this hotel, we're trying to create conflict here and there. To have this dog that's not supposed to be there, and the woman who's running the hotel knows that this lady, this guest, has her dog, but she can't prove it, so she still has to be friendly to her, and oh, how's everything going? Meanwhile, she's getting all these complaints about this woman clearly having this annoying little yappy Pomeranian dog, whatever. And then I had several other little threads like that were just kind of there in the script. It's not hurting, but it's sort of almost a Chekhov's gun, where it makes the viewer go, this is going to come back at some point. And then if the episode ends of this pilot and none of that comes back, they are going to feel cheated in some way. So what I do in that scenario, in my later drafts, is I'll just start writing down every single thing that I kind of want to do something with. The first thing that I'll do is see if I can connect any of these dots. If I can take this random moment in the script and this random moment in the script and find a way to have them connect to each other, you've solved two problems at once in the most creative way possible that also seems as though it was planned from the beginning. And that's how you solve a problem correctly, because if you're really careful and you're really creative, you will start to see these obvious patterns that will end up actually shocking you, that you didn't think of it to begin with because it seems so obvious. Are there any of these individual threads that aren't really doing enough for the story right now that could connect together like two pieces of a puzzle? And suddenly, it hit me. And if my audience is as smart as I believe you to be, you may have already figured out what I did. We have two things in the script that on their own are not doing anything. You have a character who's walking through the halls trying to solve a murder, and I want different things to be getting in her way. You have a dog causing a nuisance in the hotel, and you have an item in a purse that doesn't seem to be doing anything for the story. And what was that item again? Oh yeah, a chocolate bar.
Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate! Chocolate!
Esme LaRue is walking through the halls of the hotel. You talk about killing a pet one time. Chill out. Okay. Alright. So, what I did was I had Esme eating her chocolate bar. She's in the hall. She's sneaking up on a door. She's trying to hear what's happening inside, and suddenly, this little dog that has escaped their owner comes out into the hallway and starts yapping incessantly. So Esme thinks, I need to get this dog to stop making all this noise. What do? I know, I'll just give it a treat. I'll give it some food to shut it up. So, of course, she gives it the chocolate bar. And then later in the script, the dog is found dead, and now you have antagonistic forces created out of thin air, where this woman at the hotel who's staying there now has ample reason to not like our main character. So things are becoming more and more complicated in the script, and it all comes from two random threads that I came up with separately that I had no intention of tying together. I have another example from another script. It's another murder mystery. I had the script pretty much figured out, but I just couldn't figure out who this killer should be. And at first I had this whole backstory for that they were connected in some way, and it's this nice twist where someone she thinks she's close to is actually this killer who's been stalking her all along. Eventually I hit this moment where I thought it's so obvious that it's crazy that that wasn't the impetus of the script in the first place. So when you're able to solve it, and I can't really give away more than that because it is the twist ending of this script, which I hope to sell soon. And I can give dozens of examples of times that I've been able to do something like that in my script. I wonder if I have that sheet. I don't really want to show you guys this because, like I said, this is a script I'm actively pitching right now. Yeah, whatever. You guys aren't going to tell anyone. Okay. So this is what I'm talking about. I wrote these 4 different things here that I felt like could be improved in the script. And I found a way to connect 2 of them to each other, 1 of them to 3 of them, and 1 of them to 2 of them. And now suddenly these 4 individual threads that weren't doing anything for me in this script all feel like they are one connective tissue that holds the entire story together. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but more often than not, I'm telling you, this is the way to go. To a lot of people, writing the first draft of a script seems impossible. If you've never written a screenplay, writing 100 pages of a story from scratch might seem like an impossible feat. But ultimately what you will find is that the first draft is a piece of cake. Theoretically, I can write a first draft of a screenplay in 2 or 3 days. I've done it a few times. I think the most pages of a script I've ever written in a day is 57. I think it was in my script Blood Orange, I want to say. But yeah, you can write enormous quantities of a first draft in a day because it's called the vomit draft for a reason. The idea is just to get your ideas out onto paper as fast as possible so that you can then mold it into a true piece of art. I mean, you want to look at your screenplay the same way that a great artist looks at a cube of ice or marble. You need to be able to visualize that final product inside, and you need to get really good at seeing that your marble statue still has a chunk on it that needs to be removed. It's significantly harder with a screenplay. If you're a sculptor and you're trying to make a statue of David, if the whole thing is more or less perfect, but there's one chunk of marble left right here, and there's one chunk of marble left right here, and maybe his nose is too big, and maybe his is a human size, and you want to make sure it's shriveled. All those things are obvious when it's so clearly visual. With a story, a lot of that stuff is far less obvious, which is why you don't have 1 draft, and why you don't have 2 drafts, but why often you'll have many drafts. Now, the other day we were just talking about the Simpsons movie. The Simpsons movie, I believe, probably has the most drafts of any individual screenplay in the history of Hollywood. And the reason is that it's such enormous IP, intellectual property, that that studio, Fox, was never going to allow anything subpar to come out other than 20 years of television.
Stop! He's already dead.
So what they did was they spent about 100 drafts just trying to nail down the basic story of the script. Because of course, you know, with The Simpsons, you could have gone in so many different directions. And you will find that some stories will require more drafts than others. Sometimes your first draft will be really solid, and sometimes your first draft will be really terrible. I've written over 50 feature scripts in my life. One of the last 10 that I wrote, I would say is worse than the previous 20 or 30. And it's just because I wasn't prepared enough to go into that first draft. And it's a more clear plate of vomit than some of my other projects. Whereas I have other scripts that the first draft looks like a third or fourth draft. And then it really just takes a polish to get it to a solid place. Alternatively, I have a script that I've done 17 drafts of. I've spent probably 3,000 hours just working on improving that script. And the reason for that is that I was planning on directing that movie. So it's a little different when you are the sole creator. I'm currently in the redrafting process of a script that I'm co-writing with a gentleman by the name of Connor Susi, very talented writer-director. You can find his movie Dead Whisper on Amazon and Apple right now. The music score was done by my good friend Nikhil Kopaker, who is the composer for Wheel of Time. You may recognize his most recent track, The Hills of Tanchico. So Connor and I are developing this script. Often I'll write alone, so it was a bit of a learning experience for both of us to figure out what our style was for collaborating, and that can be its own video. But the point is, we're on probably the 6th or 7th draft at this point. I mean, it could be argued that it's only a 5th draft or whatever, but at a certain point, you start to make these changes, and then it's, all right, that's another draft, that's another draft. I can tell you that if you read the first draft that we wrote, and then read the most recent draft we wrote, we probably replaced 70% of the content of the script from the first draft to the 4th or 5th. And that final 30% is fairly similar to how it was in the first draft, but almost all of the actual dialogue in those scenes has changed. And a lot of the focus, thematically, has changed. Now, the ideal scenario when you're writing your first draft would be that you heavily outline your idea. You get a really solid concept of what you want to do with the story, and then you do the note card method of putting a scene on each note card. You have about 100 of them. That's when you kind of figure out the correct structuring of your script. That's the smart way to do it, because the more you pay attention in your outline and the more work and effort and time you put into before you write your first draft, the fewer drafts you will probably have to write. So if you're not someone who wants to go back and have to excavate their own project until they can find the nugget that should have been the main focus in the first place, damn it. Anyway, I don't know whatever. You don't want to make your life harder than it needs to be. And I've done that plenty of times, where I've written a script that had a really good concept, but I didn't execute it properly because I didn't spend enough time figuring out the structure and the outline. That is the downside to the vomit draft. I still like that technique because I just enjoy writing, and I like to be able to kind of solve the mystery on my own. As insane as that sounds, obviously you're solving it yourself one way or another, but it's just more fun to write the first draft without really knowing what's going to happen. Again, I still think you want to really figure things out as much as possible. I've written scripts where I didn't do an outline at all and just jumped right into it. And several of those scripts I never did a second draft of because it didn't deserve a second draft. It just, the concept itself isn't worth my time to go back and try to make those scripts better. Case in point, Extinction Island. I can give you 3 guesses as to what that movie's about. So yeah, it's just sometimes the script is not worth going back and doing another draft. And those ones, I'm glad that I didn't spend a bunch of time outlining. But yeah, as far as this secret project that Connor and I have been working on, which hopefully we'll be able to talk about very soon, could have used a lot more outlining beforehand, and we sort of fell into that trap of just jumping into the vomit draft with a fairly big idea. See, that's the other important key detail, is some of those scripts that I was talking about where I was able to really nail it on the first draft, as obvious as it sounds, the reason for that often is that the story was just easier. You know, sometimes it's more contained, sometimes it's about something that you know more about. If I were to try to write like an ER script or something like that, I would have to do quite a bit of research before just jumping into it, because I know that I don't know anything about that world. But if I'm writing a horror movie that takes place on Thanksgiving, and the entire thing takes place in one house, I have enough life experience to write that. Because we've all been to plenty of Thanksgivings where family drama occurred, people said things they shouldn't say, things happened that shouldn't have happened, and then on top of that, all I'm doing is just turning it into a genre flick. That was the script Blood Orange that I wrote And day one of writing that, with not much of an outline, if any, I wrote 57 pages and then finished it over the next 2 days. I believe it was, in fact, Thanksgiving. But anyway, getting back to the idea of outlining, and I've talked a little bit about outlining already, and it's always worth talking about, but yeah, I've had scripts that I wrote no outline for. I've had scripts that I came up with like a 1-page outline, and then I have scripts that I wrote 10 to 20 pages of ideas, not just the outline of all the events that I wanted to take place, but I would also come up with quotes for each of the character that could maybe get into the script somewhere, but more importantly would just kind of keep their voice in the back of my head before writing, so that anytime I'm writing a scene, I go, is this what they would say? And kind of go back to that quote, which sort of encapsulates that character, and go, no, that's not quite what they would say, or yes, that does sound like their voice. So that's some of the stuff that you can get out of outlining that can be very helpful, but at the end of the day, no matter how much effort you put into outlining your script, you're still going to need to go back and redraft. So learning the best way to do that is always going to be in your best interest. And I think there's a lot of key points that can help you get better at redrafting, but at the end of the day, no piece of advice has ever helped me more than the one I came up with myself. If you can't solve a problem, see if your other problems can. A few years ago, I discovered a foolproof method for coming up with movie ideas. The film landscape is so oversaturated at this point that it can sometimes feel like there's no original ideas left. But today, with one easy trick, I want to prove to you all that that is far from true. So check this out. We start off with a graph. On one axis, we have genre. On the other axis, we have setting. I'm just going to copy the one that I did years ago. I made some interesting choices on here, so bear with me. But just to make it easy, let's just continue with this and see where my head was at in 2000 and... oh, Jesus Christ. In genre, we have Western, horror, holiday, slasher, sports, action, adventure, mystery, sci-fi, monster, crime, fantasy, and rom-com. And in settings, just as a few random examples, we have abroad, retirement home, prison, cruise ship, wilderness, forest, desert, desert plains, savanna, tropical island, high school, restaurant, or a mall, something along those lines, an office or a hotel, big city, New York, that's pretty much it, right? And finally, we have the Alaskan tundra. So yes, these are very, very random examples. But just to show you guys how easy this is, I thought I'd start with these ones. So let's say a crime abroad. Alright, so let's just put a dot there. Okay, so now let's say a sci-fi in a retirement home. Boom. Okay? Now let's say a mystery in a prison. Alright? Let's say a slasher on a cruise ship. Alright, for desert, we're going to try rom-com, and we'll try crime. And now let's do an action movie in a tropical resort. Now let's do horror in an office. Alright, let's do a western in the big city. Just to throw things off, a monster movie in the Alaskan tundra. Alright, so here we have some potential options for stories. And you can do this at home with your own genres or settings. But just to start, here we are. Now obviously we're missing a lot here. We completely forgot one of my favorite biomes, the swamp. But that's alright. So out of this group, I identified the most interesting ones to be sci-fi in a retirement home, slasher on a cruise ship, horror in an office building, action in a tropical resort, and rom-com in the desert. Now, to take it a step further, what I did is I created a list of my favorite characters in movies and TV shows, and I started to think of them cast together in an ensemble piece. I started thinking of things like, if I were to try to make a horror movie in an office, who would be my office workers? So I came up with this list of random characters: Leslie Knope, Ace Ventura, Rocky Balboa, Ian Malcolm, Stephen Hiller from Independence Day, Creed Bratton, Carlton Banks, Daffy Duck, Tony Stark, Frank Costanza, The Grinch, Lucille Bluth, Buzz Lightyear, Hannibal Lecter, Del Griffith from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Monica Geller from Friends, Captain Quint from Jaws, Abed Nadir from Community, and Larry David from Larry David. So I came up with this list, and I tried to play that against these various stories I had. And here is our first movie. A sci-fi in a retirement home, starring Creed Bratton, Daffy Duck, Carlton Banks, Lucille Bluth, and more. So the idea there was, I took this grouping of interesting characters, and I figured, alright, well, Creed Bratton, you kind of want to have one of those more interesting, unique types instead of just doing stereotypical older people. Daffy Duck and Carlton Banks are options for potential care workers there. And then, of course, Lucille Bluth is a potential antagonist for the main characters, or one of the main characters herself. For this one, I was thinking sort of an update of a movie like Cocoon, but instead of it being a nice, heartwarming film about 50-year-olds in a retirement community, it would be a little bit more Close Encounters, Independence Day. I thought it'd be interesting to see older folks deal with that. Now, of course, you could go in different directions there. You could go Ben Stiller's The Watch, make it a actual battling aliens sci-fi comedy. You could make it a movie like Close Encounters, where it's a little more awe-inspired. E.T. sort of is in that same wavelength, but Close Encounters, even more so. A movie that is more on the drama side of things than on the horror side. And then the idea with this project is that, of course, alien activity would be very interesting to see in a retirement home, and nobody believes old people. Okay, moving on. So our second idea is a slasher on a cruise ship. Now, on this cruise ship, we have Monica Geller, Hannibal Lecter, Ian Malcolm, and Hermione Granger. Interesting mix. Well, a slasher on a cruise ship. It's the perfect trap. No escape, no mercy. Now that's a fun one, and I like the idea of a character like Hannibal Lecter not being the killer, but being someone who could be a killer, but is on vacation right now, and is forced to help these survivors, or just go his own way while this slasher is running around a cruise ship. Why am I giving you guys this gold for free? Jesus Christ. Forget that one. Okay, another one we have is horror in an office building. So I was thinking something along the lines of Paranormal Activity meets The Office. That'd be kind of cool. Normal, regular, day-to-day office workers suddenly thrust into a ghost story. That sounds like fun. And in this ghost story we have Buzz Lightyear, Abed Nadir, Leslie Knope, and yep, you guessed it, Tony Montana. I don't know where I was going with that. Yeah. So the idea being like an office park experiences a haunting. That way you're able to focus not just on one particular business, but multiple businesses at the same time, multiple groups of differing kinds of individuals dealing with a haunting. Kind of fun. Daytime haunting, obviously you have some night scenes as well. Maybe the haunting follows them home. Maybe the whole thing takes place at the office. Either way, very cool. Very fun. Next, this one's a little more standard. We've seen this before. Action in a tropical resort. Now, White Lotus has really been able to capitalize on the fun that you can have in various tropical resorts. So we may leave that one to them. But just a couple ideas I jotted down, mystery, paradise, disappearances, death, island, holiday. Yep, they covered that. Alright, moving on. Action in a Tropical Resort, I had Lucille Bluth, Stephen Hiller, Hit Girl, and George Costanza. Okay, now I see why I like this. So it would be like a White Lotus with Lucille Bluth from Arrested Development, George Costanza from Seinfeld, Stephen Hiller, Will Smith's character from Independence Day, just trying to have a vacation. It could have been at a barbecue, but we went with the tropical resort. Hit Girl. So I guess the thought there was like someone's unsuspecting child at the resort happens to have like a background in kung fu or something and is capable along with the adults in whatever this action adventure ends up being. But yeah, people getting disappeared on an island. Adventure in the wilderness. So here I have Safari Trip Disaster. Group gets lost in the wild. Now that happening with people like Del Griffith, aka John Candy from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Larry David, Dwight Schrute, and of course, the incomparable Buzz Lightyear. Now I think the reason I kept putting Buzz Lightyear in here is because I was looking for kind of an egotistical action hero wannabe type. There's other options I could have used. Anyway, the idea of someone like Dwight, someone like Larry David, and someone like Del Griffith being on a safari together and that ending up in disaster has a lot of potential for comedy. I've always loved the idea of interesting and potentially funny people in jeopardy. And by funny people, I don't necessarily mean people who are purposely funny, but people whose interactions with one another can be very funny. So for example, if the cast of Arrested Development had been marooned on the island from Lost, very different show, but possibly still very funny. That's all I'm saying. Monster in the Snowy Tundra, I have a group of people seek to survive, discover truth of monster. I don't know if that means discover the truth that there is a monster or discover the monster's secret. So one of the characters in here I have is Alan Garner. For a minute there, I could not figure out who that was. Alan Garner is the name of Zach Galifianakis' character in The Hangover. Understandable. Okay. Monster in the Snowy Tundra, starring Ace Ventura. And yes, I'm not talking about Jim Carrey, I'm talking about Ace Ventura. Now, when I say that, I don't mean I'm going to literally write the character to be Ace Ventura. I just mean that I'm going to write a character in that sort of vein. Will I end up actually going that far with it? Probably not, but it's interesting to use that as a building block. So, Monster in the Snowy Tundra, starring Ace Ventura, Tony Stark, Alan Garner, and Fiona Gallagher from Shameless. So we have this group of people trying to survive. There's a monster. Some very interesting people involved here. That's a straight-up comedy. Okay. And then finally we have Mystery in a Prison. Strange occurrences, guards are stumped, inmates are curious. Starring Captain Quint, Frank Costanza, Sarah Connor, and the Grinch. So, you see what I'm doing here. You can go a little less insane with it if you'd like. You can come up with more standard places, more standard settings, and more standard characters. But the point of the exercise is to show how incredibly easy it is to come up with a new movie idea. See, we've already come up with a dozen, and a few pretty decent ones. So, there you have it. Good luck. Go write a movie.
This was the thing that had proved most treacherous in Project Past: locations. What with high LA prices, including indie film studios that would charge more for a day than I'd allocated for a week, and costly permits necessary to legally film in the City of Angels, it was always a stressful endeavor. But this time, we had an idea called Airbnb. The idea was simple. Instead of looking for a psychiatrist's office in two different characters' homes, we'd find one house that could pass as all three. That way, no company moves, no time wasted. After many days and nights scouring the site for the most efficient option, we finally found a spot in La Cañada Flintridge. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an office, a pool, nearly everything we needed, and we used every inch of it.
That's what she said.
I paid for the place, then arranged a video call with the owner, Athleen, to offer her extra money to let us film there. The next and even more difficult location was the concert venue. Enter producer Matt to the rescue with a genius plan to rent out a local church that we'd used in the past to shoot the classroom scenes in our web series Teacher's Lounge, which I'll talk about more in the future. The church was cheap, convenient, and to top it all off, there was already a full band's worth of equipment on the stage. It was kismet. We were on our way. But there was one location I wasn't sure we'd be able to find. A location that wasn't a location at all, but a vehicle. A picture vehicle, as they're called in the industry. Buses, police cruisers, any specific car one might need for a film. A limo, a fire truck, or...
Can you put it in a bag? These pockets are really small. I have pants with bigger pockets, but I'm not sure where they are.
We found an ice cream truck online that allowed us to rent them out for regular price, under the condition that we would be requiring no ice cream. And they came through.
Another thing you can do to make your scene more dynamic, more interesting is color correction. I talked about this a lot in my behind the scenes making a Western video. When I was making Crow's Creek, the skies were completely blue the entire film. The whole film shoot, it looked serene, peaceful, tranquil, beautiful. I didn't want that. It was a horror movie. It was supposed to be dull and gray and cloudy and depressing. So what I did is I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours editing the color in every single shot until the clouds looked gray and the characters were not horribly affected by the shift in color correction. So that was a massive challenge, because anytime I tried to turn the blue skies gray, it would then mess up the color on the characters. And then I would have to keep tweaking it and tweaking and tweaking until I got exactly right. Then I would try to save that as a preset and use it on the next shot, and it wouldn't work because it was a slightly different shot. The color in the sky was a little different than the previous shot, so I'd have to start over. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of individual takes that I had to color correct manually without a ton of experience prior. So that was an absolute nightmare. It was very, very, very difficult. I'll show you in this video what it looked like before and after, so you can see how incredibly impressive I am. But on this film, I used some color correction techniques as well. The one that I did most recently, which I think you'll be able to see in this video, is I took a scene that we shot at an apartment complex. It was like a private screening room of an apartment complex, and I wanted it to feel like it was at an arcade bowling alley. So I threw in some bowling alley sound effects, and I put some music in the background that sounded like it would be playing there. But I didn't like the harsh yellow lighting that we were having in that screening room. So I decided to go nuts with it and do what I do in every room, turn it purple. So picture before, after. That's essentially what I did. But instead of using a light, I did it in color correction. The problem with that is that what happens is you actually end up changing your character's face purple, which is not good. Now you may see here, my arm is a little pink because of this light. That happens on a much harsher scale when you're using color correction in the edit. The whole fix it in post mentality, it's not a good thing. It's a funny joke, but the reason it's funny is because we realize that it is a terrible idea. It's irresponsible, and it's a one-way stop to make sure that your editing process takes much, much longer than it needs to take, which is exactly what I'm dealing with now. Now granted, in this particular situation, it wasn't so much a matter of not spending enough time in pre-production as it was the fact that that's really just all we had access to. We didn't have time during the shoot to be more careful with things like that. So I had to really be thinking on my feet at all times while we were filming to make sure that we were able to get everything that we could in camera, and everything that we couldn't get in camera, I would be fully confident that I would be able to take care of it in the edit.
Now here's an inspirational story to all you actors out there. When I was casting the role of Barrett, I had a very specific image in mind. A skinny, long-haired Jim Morrison type. I was basically ignoring anyone with a buzz cut, and auditioned one long-haired freak after the next. There were a couple people who made some very interesting choices in the audition that I appreciate more now than I did at the time. But even more interesting was how the winner got the part. Andrew didn't have the look. He wasn't even in my top 100 list of people to bring in for the role.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
But before casting him aside, instead of in the movie, I noticed he'd sent an email to the production. It was paragraphs of gratitude for the opportunity, love and respect for Pink Floyd and Dark Side of the Moon, lists of his favorite bands from the era, an expression of his clear and total understanding of not only the character, but the story itself. So I said, "F*** it." I moved his picture into the yes column and called him in to witness the best audition we'd gotten out of the bunch. We decided to save our money and risk filming without a permit. Unless Film LA is watching this, in which case, that was a joke. This is a comedy channel. No, obviously we paid for the permit. Obviously. But if we hadn't gotten the permit, we would have been very nervous the whole time we were filming in a quiet neighborhood. Because part of the process of getting a permit for a residential area is going door to door, leaving a posting of the times and days you'll legally be filming in the area. If one were to not do those things, then one would have to make sure not to attract too much attention while filming, say from a dozen vehicles parked outside, or large suspicious crates being trafficked into their elderly neighbor's home, or a man in a beanie and gloves rigging a light through a window. The risk is simple. A neighbor calls the cops ask for the permit, we say we don't have it. I mean, I have it, I don't know where I put it. I'm sure it's in my file somewhere.
Hey, comedy, huh?
Then came time for the old man scene, starring our talented friend Thane. It was an awkward enough scene to shoot already due to the dialogue.
But you're old. You're the closest one to death.
Yeah, you're ugly.
Some things are easier written than directed. That was one of them. But that was the point of the scene. Barrett is confronting his own mortality. It just made sense for him to be interacting with an older man, and speaking very flippantly to him. The problem was, our actor couldn't remember his lines. You know, the lines about him being old as shit? So I don't think that helped. But basically we're going in circles again and again, trying to get the lines out of him.
Here we go.
Baked on a buttery, crispy crust.
Baked in a buttery, flaky crust.
Baked on a buttery, crispy crust.
Finally, we decided to just write his lines down on cue cards and do it piece by piece. Though, frankly, looking back, I would have gone a different route and let them improvise a scene instead.
Baked in a buttery, crispy flake.
You have to be willing to throw everything away on the day if you really want to make real art.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
That whole sequence is just fantastic. I love the brilliant screenwriting trope of just adding in as many things that could possibly go wrong, get in your hero's way. I mean, that's writing 101. Anytime you create a problem for your character, it's easy enough to then just kind of write them out of the problem, but it's a lot more interesting to have kind of a stacking of problems and fixes. That's a lot more enticing for a viewer, to have a character who is in the middle of solving a problem, and while they're solving that problem, another problem is caused. So you're still invested in them fixing this one thing when suddenly there's a secondary thing happening, and then a third thing happens. And then once we get through that, there's another issue. You know, you have Doc Brown struggling with the plugs. Everything is falling apart. He's nearly falling off the clock tower. Then they're able to figure that out. This website I've been using for over 10 years to try to sell scripts, you can chalk that up to a total loss and go, God, I've been subscribing to this thing, I've put money into this, I've spent God knows how many hours, I've attempted 600 times to sell various scripts, and you think 600 times, man, I mean, you'd think that it was, if it was good enough, you would have done it by now. Well, that's the thing. A lot of those scripts I was trying to sell on there were not good enough. You know, there's one script in particular that I pitched 100 times before moving on to a different script. The first few years on this website, I was pitching scripts that I had written only a few years into my screenwriting career. And, you know, you can come up with some great scripts only a few years into your screenwriting career. The problem is that my screenwriting career started in high school. So I was only 18 years old thinking, oh, I got this covered. I can write a script that will really resonate with people in the industry. And that just wasn't going to happen.
for the first few years on this website, I was essentially wasting time and money trying to pitch scripts. In some cases, the script itself wasn't good. In some cases, the concept wasn't good. In some cases, the pitch wasn't good. The logline was wrong. The title was wrong. You know, you have to look at things like that. You have to understand that in order to sell a script, you need to have a great concept, and the title needs to tell the reader what that concept is. I often find that I'll come up with a really cool title. For example, this script that I pitched 100 times, it's called Fish in the Snow. Very cool title that tells you fucking nothing about what that script is about. So very often I would have producers go, oh, that's a cool title, and they get some idea in their head of what kind of a psychological thriller movie this is. They click on it, they see the very specific logline, and they go, that's not really the kind of movie I'm trying to make. Well, that doesn't mean that that script is bad. It doesn't mean that you can't sell that project. It just means that you need to literally be able to sell that project. You need to be able to pitch it accurately, adequately. Whatever you want to do, you need to have a path. And you need to have multiple paths. Your final boss is always going to be yourself. That's the lie that Mario told. The final boss is not Bowser. The final boss is you. At the end of the day, no one is standing in your way more than you are. And you need to be able to fight against yourself every single day if you want to succeed in an industry this difficult. And listen, here's the most important thing that a lot of people are not willing to talk about. You are going to need to do other jobs outside of the job that you want. You're gonna need to work a 20 to 40 hour work week doing things you don't like so that you can do an additional 60-hour work week doing the things you do like and are not getting paid for. Once you have accepted that, you at least have the power to break into this industry. And here's another thing you need to understand. You are setting yourself up for the difficulty of success in the industry. Meaning, it's not all fun and games once you get in. If you want to be a film director, it takes a certain type of personality. It takes a certain type of lunatic. So you can't look at it as, oh, I'm going to put in all this work and then I'm finally going to get there and then it's all smooth sailing. No, making movies is hard fucking work. The best of the best stress like the rest. So what am I trying to say here? Ultimately, it is understand the odds are stacked against you. Be willing to fight against those odds anyway. Find alternative sources of income so that you can support your goals, and treat your goals as hobbies so that you never give up even once the money isn't coming in. But give those hobbies the same passion as a career. The next script that I wrote, if I remember correctly, was a little bit crazy. I wrote that as a feature, and let's be honest, that was a ripoff of Scream. But in my first month of film school, I decided to make a short film out of it. We were making our first semester short film, and I thought, okay, let me take a sequence, a couple of different scenes from A Little Bit Crazy, the feature script, which is probably about 90 to 110 pages, and make a short film out of that. And so that's what I did. I starred as the serial killer. Bit of a stretch there. Wink. Monsters with Middle Names on Amazon now. So we made this short film, A Little Bit Crazy. I used the soundtrack from Kick-Ass to go full circle. I used a John Murphy score that was originally in 28 Days Later called In the House in a Heartbeat, which is a great song for horror. So that was my first short film in film school. That was the first time that I'd ever shot something that I'd actually written from a feature film, not including Zach's big movie, TM. But that was a lot of fun. It was a fun experience. And then I ended up doing the same thing. One of my next scripts was Who Dates in College, which was also a feature film, which I then turned into a short film called Who Dates in College. And it was the same thing. With A Little Bit Crazy, I actually took a chunk of the script and made that a short, which is usually better for short films. The big mistake that I made multiple times, which I would advise against generally, is trying to force an entire feature into a short film. It's so much better to either take one interesting scene from it or to try to tell a story that really works on its own as a few-minute piece. For A Little Bit Crazy, I've just found a sequence from the movie that could work as its own short film and sort of set up more of the story to come. Who Dates in College, I really did try to cram the entire feature into a short, and upon a second edit a few years later, I think I improved it a lot. You'll have to be the judge. But, you know, these short films were made when I was 17, 18, 19 years old, and you really need a lot more life experience to be a filmmaker and create art that people can actually relate to. Where the fuck am I?